This week, we're going to be looking at Confucian critics of Confucianism. And in particular, we're going to be looking at some Confucian critics of earlier forms of Confucianism in the Qing dynasty, which was the last imperial Chinese dynasty. We're going to be looking at two thinkers, Dai Zhen and Zhang Xuecheng. And actually, they were friends. They knew each other, they corresponded, and I think they had some influence on each other's philosophy. In general, what we find in the Qing dynasty is that Confucians are critical of what they take to be the formulations of Confucianism in the Song and then later in the Ming dynasty. And what we find in Dai Zhen and Zhang Xuecheng are two formulations of this critique. A little quick digression here. Pinky would like to say hi. Pinky the cat. She's not going to look at you. She's too cool for that. Oh, she's going to look a little bit towards you. You want to look over here? Say hi to people. See how pretty you are? Yeah, that's a good girl. Anyway, that's Pinky the cat. So, and she'll be wandering around here, distracting me while I lecture. So I'm going to talk first about Dai Zhen. Again, these are Qing dynasty philosophers, Dai Zhen and Zhang Xuecheng, who are critics of earlier Song and also Ming dynasty Confucian interpretations, which have been the ones we've been focusing on so far in the course. And one of the things that Dai Zhen says, this is not in the selections we gave you in Tewald and Van Norden, but it's a representative statement. He says, the Song Confucians were in and out of Taoist and Buddhist circles. Hence, they mixed in Taoist and Buddhist doctrines to formulate their own doctrines. And this is something that I have stressed in my interpretation of the Song and Ming dynasty Confucians like Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming, is that you need to understand the earlier views of the Chinese Buddhists, particularly Huayan and Han Buddhists, to understand what the Song and Ming dynasty Confucians are doing. So in a way, you could see me as being in the intellectual line of descent going back to Dai Zhen. I'm kind of a Dai Zhen sort of Confucian. And in this passage that we didn't give you the full passage, the reason we didn't give you the full passage of this line is that Dai Zhen has a long list of quotations from earlier Confucians talking about how they hung out with Taoists and Buddhists, illustrating his point. And so the details aren't that interesting, but the basic point he's making, this is part of his basic criticism of these earlier Confucians. And then Dai Zhen says what the ancients, people like Kongzi and Mengzi in the Zhou dynasty and the Warring States period, what the ancients meant by pattern, Li, was never at all what later Confucians in the Song dynasty meant by pattern. So what is pattern? Dai Zhen says pattern consists of feelings that are not in error. So when one has some matter that would affect others, one should turn within oneself and reflect tranquilly. If someone else were to affect me in this way, would I be able to accept it? So Dai Zhen diagnoses the problem with the Song dynasty Confucians like the Chun brothers and Zhu Xi, that they've interpreted pattern in a way that's influenced by earlier Buddhist conceptions of what pattern is. And they don't recognize that pattern just means good order. And to have feelings or attitudes that are in good order just means that you ask yourself, if you're doing something that affects another person, would you be okay with that if the roles were reversed? And that's all there really is to pattern. And this is all there really is to Confucianism, according to Dai Zhen, not these big metaphysical notions about pattern that we get from people like Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming. So this is kind of an overview of the key thoughts in Dai Zhen. Now let's look at how he develops them in detail. So this is a diagram you've seen 1,000 times in the course. It's Indra's net, which is the metaphor that the Huayan Buddhists use for Li pattern. And you've seen this 1,000 times before. The idea is that you've got a web of interconnections among the things in the universe. But then in order to understand any one thing in the universe, you have to see how it plays a role in this web of connections. So in every node in the web, you can see the entire pattern. So the entire pattern is, in a way, fully complete in every aspect of reality. If you wanted to fully understand me or fully understand an atom in my body, ultimately you'd have to trace out its connections to everything else in the universe. And the Neo-Confucians, people like Zhu Xi, pick up this notion and they use it, but then they say, well, you have to combine it with the notion of qi, because there's a particular endowment of qi, which is Van Norden, and a separate endowment of qi, which is each of you. But that qi includes the entire pattern of the universe. The entire pattern of the universe is complete in each of us, but it's individuated by the allotment of qi that makes each of us what it is. So the Neo-Confucians take over this notion of pattern or Indra's web, which they get from Huayan Buddhists, but they modify it slightly. But then Dai Zhen says, so all that's just review, but then Dai Zhen says, hey, you know what? What if the word pattern just meant, oh, I don't know, pattern, like the pattern of the grain in the wood, or the pattern in fields that have been laid out by farmers into different fields, the pattern of fields and farmlands. What if pattern were just an ordinary word referring to ordinary good order in the world? And Dai Zhen says that is what pattern means. It doesn't mean this complicated thing that the Huayan Buddhists thought it meant, or this complicated thing that the Neo-Confucians like Zhu Xi, influenced by the earlier Huayan Buddhists, thought that it meant. So, and this is what Dai Zhen says. He says, pattern is a term that makes reference to the close examination of things for the subtle and minute characteristics that should be distinguished in order to separate things. And so notice the earlier use of pattern that we get in Huayan and in Neo-Confucianism, in the Sung and earlier in the dynasties in that period, like the Sung and the Ming dynasty. Their notion of pattern is something that unifies things. But Dai Zhen is saying, no, pattern is what is used to distinguish or separate things. This is why it is called, and he's giving examples of ordinary usage in Chinese of the term pattern. This is why it is called the pattern for separating things, funli. When applied to concrete materials, it appears in the expressions, the pattern of the folds in the skin, the pattern of capillary pores, and refined patterns. So he's giving all these examples of how the term pattern is used, and he says, look, it's used to refer to ordinary good order in things, but an order in which things are separated from one another, not unified. He then continues with some examples from classic texts. He says, the mean says, with careful examination of the refined patterns, the sage is able to distinguish things from one another. The record of music says, music in the proper sense is able to pervade and connect the pattern in human relationships. As Zhang Xuecheng explains, and Zhang Xuecheng is one of the Han Dynasty commentators, as Zhang Xuecheng explains in his commentary on the passage, to be well ordered is to be separated into parts. In his preface to the explanation of simple and compound characters, Xu Shan, that's another Han Dynasty thinker, says, by knowing the pattern for separating things, things can be mutually distinguished. He then concludes, what the ancients meant by pattern was never at all what later Confucians in the Sung and Ming dynasty, like Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming, meant by pattern. Why? Because what people meant in ancient times, as you can see in these classics, by pattern was just good order in a way that's not really metaphysically loaded or metaphysically complicated. And that order was typically an order of things that were in some way separate or distinct from one another. So how did people get so confused about what pattern means? Well, Dai Zhen says, one rarely sees the word pattern in the 6 classics, the words of Kongzi and Mengzi, or even in the biographies and assorted historical documents. Now, when you see 6 classics, you're probably thinking, well, for crying out loud, Van Norden, you've been going on since week 1 of this course about the 5 classics and the 4 books. I thought there were 5 classics in the Han Dynasty. And then these got their prominence in Confucian education was later displaced by the 4 books. Yeah, there are 5 classics, but people often talk about the 6 classics because it was a common belief that there had been a 6th classic, the classic of music, and that we have fragments of the classic of music that survive, but that we'd lost the 6th classic. So when people say 6 classics, it just means the 5 classics plus one more classic that supposedly had existed in ancient times, but no longer survives. So when you see 6 classics, just think of the 5 classics we've talked about before. So Dai Zhen says, one rarely sees the word pattern in the 6 classics, the words of Kongzi and Mengzi, or even in the biographies and assorted historical documents. Is that true? Well, let's take a look at the 4 books. I looked this up. These are occurrences of the term pattern, li, in the 4 books. 0 times in the Analects, 0 times in the Great Learning, twice in the Mean, and a grand total of 7 times across only 3 passages in the Mengzi. He's right, doesn't occur very often. How often does it occur in Zhu Xi's commentary on the 4 books? And Zhu Xi's collected commentaries on the 4 books are just supposed to explicate the teachings of the classic. And again, I looked it up. You can look it up online and do a word search. The word pattern occurs 394 times in Zhu Xi's collected commentaries on the 4 books. Only 9 of those occurrences are actually in the 4 books. All the other occurrences are Zhu Xi explaining what he takes the 4 books to mean, and he can't explain what he thinks the 4 books mean without appealing to pattern, even though the term pattern almost never occurs in the 4 books. So I think Dai Zhen's right about this. Dai Zhen continues, but nowadays all people, even the most foolish of people who engage in perversion and self-indulgence, readily invoke pattern when making managerial decisions or holding another person accountable. So even though the ancient Confucians never talked about pattern, because of the way that pattern has become predominant in later Confucian philosophy, everybody says, oh, I'm following pattern. I'm doing only what's required by pattern. Since the Song Dynasty, certain mutually reinforcing habits have become established custom. So the people now regard pattern as though there were some thing within, obtained from heaven, and endowed in its entirety in the mind. And accordingly, they allow personal opinion to take on the role of pattern. So the idea is that it's because of the influence of these Song Dynasty Confucians that people have gotten it into their head that pattern is this weird metaphysical concept. It's this thing that contains all structure within itself, that's completely present in everyone and that's present in my mind. And Dai Zhen says, if you look at the ancient classics, nobody actually talks this way. So where did the Song Confucians get this idea? He says the Song Confucians describe pattern in superlative terms, calling it utterly pure and expansive. But this just exchanges the word pattern for what the Taoists, Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, and the Buddhists refer to as a true master and true emptiness. This is just to transfer the words of Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, and the Buddhists into Confucian discourse, treating them as the words of the 6 classics, Kongzi and Mengzi. So again, you can see where I'm getting this stuff that I've been telling you in the course about how you got to understand the earlier Buddhists to understand the Song and Ming Dynasty Confucians, not only because the Song and Ming Dynasty Confucians are openly critical of Taoists and Buddhists, although they are, but also because they've absorbed all these key concepts like pattern from the earlier Taoists and especially the Buddhists. Dai Zhen continues, how do we now dissect and distinguish between these 2 traditions so that they aren't confused with one another? And by the 2 traditions, he means Confucianism versus all the heterodox teachings like Taoism and Buddhism. The answer that Dai Zhen supplies is, with respect to heaven, earth, people, things, affairs, and actions, I've not heard of any that cannot be talked about in terms of its pattern which is just good order for Dai Zhen. To grasp the pattern of heaven, earth, people, things, affairs, and actions is to restore them to the state that is necessary for them, biran, without ever eliminating anything that comes naturally to them, suran. So what Dai Zhen's suggesting is that to be well-ordered, have a good pattern, to be the way you should be, is just to be the way that is necessary for you. But that doesn't transcend the way you are naturally. It just perfects your natural inclinations. It doesn't get rid of them. So what did the ancients mean when they spoke of heavenly pattern? And so Dai Zhen's imagining somebody who's asking him questions and says, okay, but there is this phrase heavenly pattern, tianli, that does occur in ancient writings. What did it mean? Dai Zhen answers, pattern consists of feelings that are not in error. Whenever one grasps the essential feelings, one grasps pattern. So when one has some matter that would affect others, one should turn within oneself and reflect tranquilly. If someone else were to affect me in this way, would I be able to accept it? Whenever one imposes some responsibility on others, one should turn within oneself and reflect tranquilly, if someone else were to impose this responsibility on me, would I be able to fully exert myself to fulfill it? When one applies the measure of the self to others, pattern can become clear. So all you need to do, and this is something that some of you asked about or noticed in the earlier Confucians, you said, well, how do I know what the pattern is? And if I'm just trying to follow the pattern, can't it become overly subjective? And Dai Zhen's answer is yes, trying to just follow an abstract pattern, especially one that somehow you think, transcends our embodiment or our natural instincts, that, you're not following anything very concrete. All you do is you take your normal human desires and motivations, and when you do something that affects another person, you try to calmly ask yourself, okay, if I were that person, would I be okay with me treating them as I'm proposing to treat them? If I would, then my actions are acceptable. And Dai Zhen makes clear at a certain point that this test of asking, if the roles were reversed, would I be okay with someone else treating me this way, is not something he just made up. He got it out of the Confucian classics. And it's found in the Analects, for example, where one of Confucius's disciples, Zogong, asked, is there one teaching that can serve as a guide for one's entire life? The master, Kongzi, replied, is it not sympathetic understanding? Shu. Do not impose upon others what you yourself do not desire. So you don't need to find some abstract metaphysical pattern to guide yourself. All you need to do is start from your normal human feelings, but then recognize that other people have these same feelings. And when you do something that affects another person, ask, would I be okay with that? If I would not be okay with another person treating me that way, then that's not an appropriate action. If I would be okay with it, then it is an appropriate action. Now, this kind of test, it's a version of what is sometimes called the golden rule in Western moral philosophy. It's sometimes formulated in positive terms. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you is a common Christian formulation. That phrasing goes back to the King James Bible. We do find positive formulations of it in some Confucian texts as well, but there's also negative formulations, like in this case, do not inflict upon others that which you yourself would not want. But a natural objection that is raised to this is, well, what if other people have different tastes? What if other people would like things that I would like? This is why Dai Zhen makes a reference to essential feelings. And he brings this up in connection with being asked a question about a passage in the Mengzi. Because remember, Dai's work that we're reading for this course, the Mengzi Ziyi Shuzheng, it's an evidential commentary on the meaning of terms in the Mengzi. So it's really in the form of a commentary, which is a genre, as we've seen, many people wrote in this period. It it's natural for Dai Zhen to write in this format because people in his era will understand the form in which he's writing and they'll immediately get what he's saying. But I understand for you as a contemporary 21st century person reading this, it's kind of hard to get the big picture of what Dai Zhen's doing. So Dai Zhen, and the same is true of Zhang Xuecheng, they've written in a style that will make sense to their contemporaries, but it makes it harder for us to see what their point is. But that's okay, you got me to explain it for you. So Dai Zhen is imagining someone asking this question about the Mengzi, which he's explaining. That's the point of this work, is to interpret the Mengzi. The Mengzi says, and this is a line from the Mengzi, pattern and righteousness are that which all minds prefer in common. The sages were just the first to grasp that which our minds prefer in common. And I noted that the Mengzi, there's a handful, like 7 references across 3 passages to pattern in the Mengzi. This is one of those references. And then the questioner continues, here again, pattern, that is being well ordered, is described in terms of mind. Why is that? Dai Zhen replies, only if it's what all minds affirm in common can it be called pattern and righteousness. That which is not yet affirmed in common and still inheres in one's personal opinions is neither pattern nor righteousness. When one person regards something as so, and the myriad generations of people throughout the world would say, this is correct and cannot be changed, this is what is meant by affirmed in common. So, for example, I like cats. Obviously, I've got a cat. And so, maybe I've got a friend and I want to do something nice for them. And so I give them a cat. Well, that could be a nice thing to do if they like cats and they're not allergic to cats and they're on the market for a pet. They would enjoy having a pet with their lifestyle. But that's not something that everybody is the same about. Some people are allergic to cats. Some people, I don't understand how, but some people actually don't like cats. Or other people have a lifestyle where even a low maintenance pet, like most cats are, it just doesn't work for their lifestyle, which involves lots of traveling and lots of working outside the home. So in asking what you should do for others, you have to ask, what are the essential feelings that are relevant? The feelings that everybody across different eras and different cultures affirms. In this passage, I'll just mention, Dai continues, the text, the Mengzi, refers to pattern to highlight the mind's ability to make distinctions, and refers to righteousness to highlight the mind's ability to consider and decide a matter. And so remember, a lot of what Dai Zhen's doing is exegesis or commentary on the classics. And if you're reading the classic of the Mengzi, you might wonder, why does Mengzi use both the word pattern and the word righteousness? And so Dai Zhen's explaining, well, pattern is highlighting the fact that our mind has this ability to make distinctions. Again, the role of pattern in making distinctions between things. And he's using the word righteousness to emphasize the fact that the mind has an ability to decide a particular concrete state of affairs, or what you should do in a particular concrete state of affairs. So, but again, you're judging how your actions would affect others in terms of feelings you can expect anybody to have. But still, Dai Zhen knows that after centuries of people reading Sung and Ming Dynasty Confucianism, and up through the Qing, people still have to read the 4 books and they have to read Zhu Xi's commentaries on the 4 books. So Zhu Xi's way of reading the classics seems compelling to people. So he imagines somebody saying, well, yeah, I see what you're saying, but the record of music, which is a chapter in the record of rights, says that heavenly pattern is extinguished while fully indulging in human desires. This saying seems to treat the distinction between what comes from pattern and what comes from desire as a distinction between what's right and what's wrong. How do you deal with this? So in other words, don't the Sung Confucians have a better explanation of what heavenly pattern means, at least in the case of this quotation? Dai replies, the desires of human nature must be regulated. If they are regulated and not excessive, this is in accordance with heavenly pattern. But this doesn't assume that heavenly pattern is right and human desire is wrong. Heavenly pattern consists in regulating one's desires so that one doesn't thoroughly indulge the human desires. For these reasons, while the desires cannot be fully indulged, they cannot be eliminated either. How can we say that it is against heavenly pattern when the desires are regulated so that they neither exceed nor fall short of our essential feelings? So Dai is saying, yeah, the record of music does say that, heavenly pattern, involves the regulation of our desires. And Dai says, I'm not saying that our desires should be unregulated. I'm not saying that there's no way in which our desires can go wrong or be excessive or, for that matter, be deficient. But what I'm saying is that there's nothing to the heavenly pattern but having desires which are appropriate for the situation. And what are desires that are appropriate for the situation? The ones that do not inflict on others things that you would not want if the situation were reversed. And now Dai applies this to a really famous passage that we've talked about before in the Mengzi 2a6. Mengzi said, suppose someone saw a child about to fall into a well. Anyone in such a situation would have a feeling of alarm and compassion. And that's a direct quotation from Mengzi 2a6. And this is an illustration of this story, a contemporary illustration by my colleague, Helen de Cruz. But then Dai explains, but what's called compassion and what's called benevolence aren't like things stored in the mind, which is how the Sung and Ming Confucians thought about pattern, as if it were a thing, a metaphysical entity somehow present in your mind that includes the entire structure of the universe in it. Dai says, that's not what compassion and benevolence are. They're not like things stored in the mind standing apart from the faculty of understanding. They're rather when our faculty of understanding is functioning correctly, that's what pattern is. And then he says, and this is fascinating, he says, it's because one understands for oneself the love of life and fear of death that one feels alarm about the endangerment of the child and would respond compassionately to the child's death. How could one have a mind that feels alarm and distress if he were without a mind that loves life and fears death? So in other words, Dai is saying, look, the reason that we're capable of having compassion for others is that we can sympathize with their suffering, with their death, but also with their happiness and with their life, because we are creatures who love life and fear death. We are creatures who have desires and want those desires to be fulfilled. If we lacked those desires, compassion would be impossible. So things like your desire for life and your desire for food and your desire for comfort and your desire for health, those aren't selfish human desires, to use that phrase that the Neo-Confucians love to use in a negative way. Those aren't negative things, those are positive things. Because if you didn't love life and you didn't love physical satisfaction, you couldn't have compassion for other creatures. Dai continues, and the same is true analogously for disdain, deference, and approval and disapproval, which, if you remember Mengzi 2a6, these are the emotional reactions which are the basis for the virtues of righteousness, wisdom, and ritual propriety. And Dai continues, if we were to shed completely the desires for drink, food, sexual intimacy, and every affective reaction to external things, thereby returning to a state of mental tranquility and oneness, wherein could there be disdain, deference, or approval and disapproval? In other words, it's only because we want food, we want to drink things, we want sexual intimacy, we want physical comfort, that we're capable of having these emotions like shame at certain inappropriate ways of satisfying our desires. And what are the inappropriate ways of satisfying our desires? The ways that hurt others in ways we would not want to be hurt if the roles were reversed. What are the bad ways of satisfying our desire for comfort or wealth or food or drink? The ways that hurt others in ways that we would not accept if the roles were reversed. But if we didn't have those desires in the first place, there wouldn't be any point to these. This is, by the way, this image here is a detail from the Night Revels of Han Shijai, which is a very, very famous Chinese painting. And it shows a scene of scholars listening to music and eating food and having a good time with their friends. It's a really interesting, fascinating painting, and its political message is actually very complex. And so it's worth learning more about. But I just enjoy showing it as an illustration of people enjoying satisfying their desires. But actually, the painting is much more complicated than that representation I'm using suggests. Dai Zhen continues, from this it can be understood that benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom are nothing else. They are not about transcending the love of life and fear of death. They're not about transcending the desires for drink, food, sexual intimacy, and every affective reaction to external things. They're not about transcending those things in order to return to a state of mental tranquility and oneness. And to illustrate this point, I'm showing a reproduction from a painting of two lovers embracing. And Dai is saying things like the desire for sexual intimacy, that's not something that is problematic about humans. It's not something that needs to be transcended. Indeed, if you yourself didn't know what it was to love others and to want intimacy, you wouldn't be able to understand the suffering of others or what it is to hurt others in the pursuit of things like sexual intimacy or the love of life and the fear of death. So there's a way in which Dai is really legitimating our embodiment and our sensual desires. And he thinks this is what original Confucianism is about. And he thinks that the Confucians of the Song and later dynasties lost touch with this because they were, even though they were critics of Buddhism and Daoism, they ended up being influenced by these Buddhist and Taoist ways of thinking about the world, which encouraged us to transcend our embodiment and our attachment to things like physical desire. Dai continues, the ancient worthies and sages did not seek outside of the desires for what they regarded as benevolence, righteousness, propriety, or wisdom, the four cardinal virtues of the Confucian tradition, nor did they separate these virtues from the blood and qi or mind's faculties of understanding. But later Confucians, and again, he means people like Zhu Xi, Wang Yangming, Lu Shangshan, Sheng brothers. But later Confucians regarded them as like a separate object, anchored and attached to the qi to form a separate nature, right? So again, think about the way that people like Zhu Xi or Wang Yangming talk about the pattern as if it were a thing which is present within you, but somehow contains the pattern of everything else in the world. And Dai says that's not what being patterned or well-ordered meant for the ancient Confucians. For the ancient Confucians, being patterned or well-ordered just meant being in the right condition for the kind of thing you are. And the kind of thing you are is a desiring creature with physical desires. And there's nothing wrong with satisfying those desires as long as you don't satisfy them in a way that inflicts upon others things that you would not accept if the situation were reversed. And in making these judgments, the thing to focus on is the desires and the needs that we have in common, not the ones that are idiosyncratic to us, right? So I might want to go play poker in Las Vegas, and that's fun for me, but it's not something that would necessarily be fun for you. And so I shouldn't assume that it's what you want. But you and I, we both don't want to go hungry. We don't want to be cold. We don't want to not have a place to live. We don't want to be without friends. We don't want to be without romantic attachments. These are universal human desires, although we satisfy them in different ways. So we shouldn't do things to other people that prevent them from getting enough to eat or having a warm place to live in the winter and a cool place to live in the summer, and prevent them from having families or enjoying the joys of romantic and erotic relationships. So how did these later Confucians get confused about this? He says this was because they mixed in the teachings of Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, and the Buddhists, and in the end, this obscured the teachings of Mengzi, Kongzi, and the six classics. So in a nutshell, this is Dai Zhen's critique of earlier Confucians and where he thinks they went wrong. And again, in a way, the whole course has been building up to this because I'm very much in the kind of Dai Zhen school of Confucianism. So I think Dai Zhen's right about a lot. I think personally, I think he's right about the way in which you can't really understand the role that pattern Li and heavenly pattern, Tian Li, plays in the Song and Ming dynasty Confucians like Juxi and Wang Yangming, unless you understand how they got this concept of pattern from Huayan and Chan Buddhists. And I think there is a way in which Confucians in the Song and the Ming were, a lot of them, very anti-desire. They use Renyu, human desires, as if it had a negative connotation. But I think Dai Zhen's right to point out, look, you really can't be against human desires if you're a Confucian, because Confucians are about satisfying your desires in a moderate way, consistent with satisfying the other people, also satisfying their desires. And the only question to ask is, in satisfying my desires, am I doing it in a way that is inflicting unfair burdens on others? And the test of unfairness is, when it comes to desires we all have in common, desires to be free of fear of violence, desires to have a home, to be warm in winter and cool in summer, to have enough food to eat and things to drink, to have loving relationships with other people, to satisfy our romantic and sexual desires. Are we preventing other people from doing this, or are we acting in a way that's satisfying our desires, consistent with other people satisfying their desires? As a Confucian, that's your primary question. So I'm very influenced by Dai Zhen in these respects, but I know when you read the Mengzi Zi Shuzheng, the evidential commentary on the meaning of terms in Mengzi, the way it's written, at first, it's really hard to see where he's going with this, but he's writing in a style that makes sense for his contemporaries in the Qing dynasty, but doesn't make as much sense for us today. But then I think there is something that even Dai Zhen's missed, and I think his friend and colleague, Zhang Xuecheng, got this right. And so we're going to go on to Zhang Xuecheng next. So Zhang Xuecheng, you can see he's a slightly younger contemporary of Dai Zhen's. And here are a few quotations that give you like an overall sense of Zhang Xuecheng's thought. And by the way, it's kind of neat, as we're getting later into Chinese history, we actually do have a sense of what these guys looked like, because we do have what purport to be surviving representations of them. So whereas with people like Mengzi and Kongzi, there's people draw or paint Mengzi and Kongzi, of course, but they're just guesses because we have no idea what they look like. But for people like Dai Zhen and Zhang Xuecheng, we kind of do. So Zhang Xuecheng says, the changes developed from the trigrams of Emperor Fuxi, but we need not follow him in wearing straw clothing and living in the wild, because Fuxi in his era, that's what he did. He wore straw clothing and he lived in the wild. But even though he developed the trigrams of the changes, which is really historically important, we don't have to do what he did. The documents begins with the canon of Shun, but we need not weep and cry to heaven as Shun did. Shun had a really dysfunctional family. And so the canon of Shun, which is part of the documents, the classic of history, talks about how he wept and cried to heaven because he was so sad because his parents were so mean to him. But fortunately, not everybody has a family that's as dysfunctional as Shun's family. So although he was doing what was right for him, that doesn't mean that we should do what he did. And then elsewhere, Zhang says, if we look at the behavior of the sages in history, there was first some need and then the meeting of it, first some anxiety and then the expression of it, first some abuse and then the remedying of it. When a sage at any given time created an institution, it was like wearing linen in the summer and fur in the winter. What does that mean? It means that what the sages do is a response to the needs and the problems of the concrete situation that they face. And so just like you wear linen, loose, light clothes in the summer because they're cool, and you wear fur or heavy coats in the winter because it's cold, your actions should be responsive to the situation you're in. You don't just follow a model that somebody gave you in the past and just do what they did. You respond how it is appropriate to respond to your historical situation. And this is what Zhang Xuecheng meant by a famous slogan of his. He doesn't use this slogan in the selections we gave you in T. Wald and Van Norden, readings in later Chinese philosophy, but we cite it in the introduction to Zhang Xuecheng selections. The 6 classics are all histories. Now, that would have seemed paradoxical to Zhang's contemporaries because they know, well, some of the classics are histories, like the Documents is a work of history. The Spring and Autumn Annals is a work of history. But other ones are like the Odes, the Shijing, that's a poetic work, right? And the Changes is a book of divination, but the appendices are also more like philosophical works. So what do you mean the 6 classics are all histories? What Zhang means by saying the 6 classics are all histories is that the 6 classics are what the sages wrote down about how they responded to particular concrete situations that they felt. And you have to read them in historical context and read them as examples of what the sages did in response to particular needs, not as stating some abstract way that everybody should follow. So what Zhang Xuecheng's philosophy is about is historicizing the Confucian classics and reading them as works that are valuable to us, but valuable to us as examples of how sages responded to particular historical situations, not as records of what everybody should do in every situation. And that's a really fascinating idea. So let's look at in more detail at how he develops this idea. So like Dai Zhen, Zhang Xuecheng has a bone to pick with the scholars of the Song and the Ming dynasties. Again, people like Zhu Xi and Wang Yangming. So Zhang says, where the Song dynasty scholars went wrong was in trying to get people to abandon things and just talk about the way in the abstract. Kongzi taught people to, quote, make an extensive study of literature, but scholars of the Song said, to trifle with things dissipates the will. Zhangzi, who was one of the immediate disciples of Kongzi and supposedly wrote the commentary section in the Great Learning, Zhangzi taught people, in one's words, stay far from what is improper. But the scholars of the Song said to work at literature injures the way. As for what the Song scholars said, it's an excellent prescription for a desperate situation. However, a prescription should only attack the disease that is infecting one's vital organs. The ideas of the Song scholars seem to regard the organs themselves as a disease and want to get rid of them entirely. What does that mean? It means Zhang thinks that the Song dynasty scholars were responding to earlier Confucians who were too obsessed with texts and too obsessed with literature. Remember how I said in an earlier lecture that Han Dynasty Confucianism was kind of philosophy as philology, philosophy as the study of words and the study of texts. And so Zhang thinks that in the Song dynasty, this later dynasty, people reacted to the overemphasis on words and texts in the Han dynasty by saying, stop focusing so much on texts. And as a prescription for an overemphasis on texts, that's not a bad thing to do. But Dai says, you don't throw out the organs while you're treating the disease the organs have. And he thinks that the Song dynasty Confucians didn't take the text seriously enough and didn't take them seriously enough in the right way. He continues, in their search for human nature and heaven, they, the Song dynasty people like Zhu Xi, and then the Ming dynasty people like Wang Yangming, de-emphasized recitation of the classics and suppressed writing. What is there to choose between two such extreme views, either overemphasizing texts or just throwing them out entirely? Nevertheless, their great finesse in the analysis of pattern and the sincerity of their practice far exceeded anything found in the scholars of the Han and Tang dynasty. So he says, look, let's give the devil his due. The Song scholars, actually did do a lot in terms of analyzing pattern, and they were very sincere in their practice. So there was a point to what they were doing, but they went too far. And how did they go too far? What Zhang Xuecheng is going to go on to do is he's going to give us a theory about the relationship between the way and the actions of the sages. And in explaining his theory, he's going to emphasize each of the passages from the changes that I said in my lecture on the changes were a center of debate for later Confucians. And so remember I said when we looked at the changes that later Confucians really focus on a handful of passages, mostly from the Great Appendix, in debating the significance of the classic of changes. And we see each of those passages discussed by John. And he's got this really interesting theory about how the way is related to our practices. So he starts out by saying the changes says the alternation of yin and yang is called the way. This indicates that the way already was present before human beings existed. Therefore, those matters for which one can describe the form or name the name are all the detailed effects of the way, but are not themselves the way. So anything you can put into words, anything you can describe is an effect of the way. It's not the way in itself. For the way is that by which all things and affairs are as they are, 所以然. It's not how they should be, 当然. However, all that human beings are able to see is how things and affairs should be. So the way is the transformation of yin and yang, the natural processes of the universe. That's not something you can ultimately describe, or it's the pattern of these transformations, which in a way goes beyond our ability to describe it. What we can talk about is how sages have responded to these transformations. From the beginning of humankind to groupings of 5 and 10, onto hundreds and thousands, and up to the creation of sovereigns and teachers and the distinguishing of provinces and the marking off of fields, it appears always that there was first some need and then the meeting of it. First some anxiety and then the expression of it. First some abuse and then the remedying of it. So what the sages do is respond to the natural condition that humans are confronted with by the world. And in responding to those natural conditions and the needs that arise, humans are doing what they ought to do. And we can describe what the sages do, which is what they ought to do. But in describing that, we're not describing a way which is true for all time. We are describing how sages in particular historical situations responded to particular needs they were confronted with. This has some very big implications, but let's see a little bit more detail how this applies in a particular case. When heaven and earth produced human beings, the way existed, but it had not yet taken a concrete shape. As soon as there were 3 people living together in one house, the way took shape, but was not yet plainly manifested. When there came to be groups of 5 and 10, and these grew to hundreds and thousands, one house could not possibly accommodate them all, and so they split into groups and separated into classes, and the way became manifest. The concepts of benevolence and righteousness, loyalty and filial piety, and the institutions of penal and administrative laws, ritual and music, were all things that could not but arise thereafter. So he's giving you this kind of evolutionary account of how humans come into existence, and then they gradually form larger and larger communities. And our institutions and our rituals and our laws and our classics, like the 5 or 6 classics, arise as responses to concrete needs. So the classics, the 6 classics and the 4 books, are not texts which record a way which is true for all time and all people. The 6 classics and the 4 books record particular historical responses of the sages to the particular situations they were in. So when a sage at any given time created an institution, it was like wearing linen in the summer. Linen's light, and so in the summer when it's hot, you wear something that's light and cool. And fur in the winter. In the winter it's cold, so you wear fur or you wear some kind of heavy coat. Their institutions are not instances of their giving rein to their fancy, saying, I must do such and such in order to be different from men of former times, or I must do such and such in order that I may make my fame equal to that of the former sages. Honestly, I think a lot of scholars who write today, that's what all they're trying to do. It's like, I just have to say something new. It's like, how about saying something right for a change? But anyway, Dai is saying, look, you have to understand what the sages did as responding to, they didn't invent things for the sake of inventing them, or just to be clever. They responded to particular needs they faced. These things were all necessary results of the alternation and revolution of yin and yang, but they themselves, what the sages did, cannot be considered the way, which is the alternation of yin and yang itself. The alternation and revolution of yin and yang are like the wheels of a cart. The sages' fashioning of institutions, just like the wearing of linen in the summer and fur in the winter, is like the tracks of such wheels. So let's think about that metaphor for a second. So Zhang is saying that the way, which is the alternation and the revolution, the transformations of yin and yang, in other words, the way which is the transformations of the natural world, the transformation of the seasons, the transformations of our natural environment. That's like the wheel of a cart. The sages' fashioning of institutions, so the particular rituals we have, the particular laws we have, the particular institutions we have, and the particular sacred classic texts we have, like the 6 classics or the 4 books, or the Bible, or the Quran, or the Torah, or the Bhagavad Gita, or the Vedas, or the Sutras. These are like these are records of wearing linen in the summer and fur in the winter. They're like the tracks that the wheel leaves behind. And the danger is that people think they're describing the way in itself, when in fact, all they're describing is the tracks left behind by the way. And of course, the tracks will vary depending on the terrain that you're in. Another way Zhang puts it is he says, the changes says, what is above with respect to form is called the way, and what are below with respect to form are called concrete things. What does that mean? He says, the way can no more be abstracted from the material world than a shadow can be separated from the shape that casts it. If you can't see at first glance, that's a cat casting a very intimidating looking shadow on a sunny day. And so, but this is important. It says, look, Zhang is saying that the problem with many earlier Confucians is they thought, I can abstract the way from its particular embodiments in the material world. And furthermore, they thought that the classics were abstractions of the way from context. And Zhang says, completely wrong. You cannot, nothing we as humans can talk about or name or describe or do is the way in itself. All we can describe and write down and do is the way that the way manifests itself in the material world, which is just like a shadow compared to the shape, which is the way. Dai continues, because those in later ages who accepted Kongzi's teachings obtained them from the 6 classics, they came to regard the 6 classics as books that set forth the way. However, they failed to realize that the 6 classics all belong to the realm of concrete things. So again, the six classics are not books that record the way. Neither are the four books. These are historical works that record how the sages responded to the needs of their era. Yes, we can learn from them by seeing how wise people responded to their problems. But that doesn't mean that we should repeat and copy what they did, because they were responding to their historical era while we respond to ours. So Zhang explains, now the way is revealed in the realm of actual things and affairs. It's not something named by human beings, right? So the actual rituals and conventions and institutions, those are things we can name and talk about. The way transcends those things. It can never be fully put into words. It was when there were people talking about the way that the way began to be labeled differently by different people. This is what is meant by when the Changes says, the benevolent person sees it and calls it benevolence, the wise person sees it and calls it wisdom. So we see the same thing, the effects of the way in different ways, but that's because the way transcends anything we could put into words. So let's think overall about Zhang's analogies. He says the way is to specific concrete things as what is above with respect to form is to what is below with respect to form. So far, he's just like paraphrasing the Changes, the great appendix to the Changes. But he says another way you could think about it is that the way is like the wheel of a cart, and concrete things that the sages do or that we ought to do are like the tracks left by that wheel. Zhang says that a shape or a form is what the way is like, and then concrete things are like the shadow cast by the way. The way is that by which things are as they are. In other words, it's the transformations of the natural world and of history. How things should be is the way we respond to the transformations of our environment and the transformations of history. The way is the alternation of yin and yang, the natural transformations of the world. The sages fashioning institutions, conventions, rituals, laws, that is like concrete things, like the shadow, the tracks left behind by the way. And the way is, another way of thinking about the way is that it's contrasted with anything we can name or describe in words, like what you find in the six classics or like what you find in the five books. What's the payoff of all of that? The payoff is that the sages saw what they found in the classics simply as things that had to be as they were. They never saw beyond this any way set forth in these books. Kongzi transmitted the six classics to instruct posterity because he believed that the way of the ancient sages and kings is something that cannot be seen. The way of the ancient sages and kings is not something that can be seen. It's not something that can be described in words. While the classics are the thing that comes from the way, which can be seen, which can be put into words. He thought that people of later times, who have not themselves seen the ancient kings, ought to use these records concerning actual things and affairs, which they could keep and treasure in order to grasp in understanding the invisible way. And so Kongzi made clear the government doctrines of the ancient kings in the documents, which the officials had kept in order to show them to others. He did not write theories of his own, which would have been to talk about the way divorced from the real world. So in other words, one way of thinking about it is, if you are part of a religious or spiritual tradition that regards some text as in somehow sacred or authoritative, like maybe you're a Christian and you think the Bible is authoritative, or maybe you're a Muslim and you think the Quran is authoritative, or you're Jewish and you think the Torah is authoritative, or you're Hindu and you think the Vedas are authoritative, or you're Buddhist and you think the sutras are authoritative, or maybe you don't belong to any spiritual or religious tradition that regards text as authoritative, but you're interested in how these people who do have these views approach their texts. There's a couple ways they can look at those texts. One way is to say these texts embody a way of life, and our job is to replicate the way of life that we find in these classic texts. But what Zhang is proposing is very different. Zhang is saying revering the texts doesn't mean thinking that the texts have embodied the way, which after all transcends anything you could put into words. Revering the text is thinking that these are examples of how the sages in the past responded to the concrete needs that they faced in intelligent, thoughtful ways. And we can learn from them how we might think about responding to our own situation. But we can only do that by recognizing that the classics are history. They're works of particular individuals at particular points in time, wrestling with the problems they faced. We can't copy and paste their solutions for our contexts, but we can learn from their wisdom in responding to problems to give us guidance about how we might respond to the needs and the problems that we face. This is why Zhang says the changes developed from the trigrams of Emperor Fuxi, but we need not follow him in wearing straw clothing and living in the wilds. So Socrates developed the Socratic method, which became central to Western philosophy. That doesn't mean that we have to run around in a toga. The documents begin with the canon of Shun, but we need not weep and cry to heaven as Shun did. So the Bible is a wonderful book. That doesn't mean we have to follow we have to live the way that Moses did, or we have to live exactly the way that Jesus did, because they were living in their particular historical context. My point, Zhang concludes, is that the domain in which the truth of these classics is to be applied always differs. So you have to read the classics as history, and that's not inconsistent with reading them carefully and revering them, but you revere them as responses to our historical and environmental situation, not as abstract statements of the way which hold for all time. Now, part of what's really exciting about this, and I'm hardly the first person to make this comparison, Zhang has been compared to the Western philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. If you're trying to impress people at a cocktail party, you might say things like, well, of course, I'm a Hegelian. Now, what would it mean to say you're a Hegelian? Well, Hegel and Zhang Xuecheng are similar in that both of them think that rationality and morality have to be historicized. So what it is rational to believe depends on the historical era you're in. What it is moral to do depends on the historical era you're in. So, for example, it was rational at one point in history to believe that the Earth was the center of the solar system and the sun and the other planets went around it. It's no longer rational to believe that. It may have been moral at one time in history to have an emperor who is not elected and who has unlimited, Confucians thought the emperor has unlimited authority, as we'll see in another lecture, but a system of government in which the highest position is held by a hereditary monarch, that may have been moral at one point in history. It's not a defensible view to have now. So this notion that rationality and morality are not subjective, and they're not just relative to your opinion, but they are historically conditioned. We find this idea in both Hegel and in Zhang Xuecheng, right? So again, if you really want to impress people at a dinner party, just say like, well, I'm a Hegelian, although frankly, I think Zhang Xuecheng had a better formulation of it earlier than Hegel did. And then they'll know that you went to Vassar, which is one of the few places you can study both Hegel and Zhang Xuecheng. Now, of course, I'd be remiss if in talking about Hegel, if I didn't cite the great Hegel scholar, Chuck Woolery. Chuck Woolery is a game show host, is famous for Wheel of Fortune, among other game shows, and I think he did a reboot of The Dating Game and some other game shows. And he's recently become a conservative political pundit. And he tweeted a couple of years ago, he said, if you claim to be a progressive, you're saying that Hegel a German political philosopher of the 1800s, has a better idea of government for America than our founding fathers and our Constitution? I don't think so. And that is exactly what Democrats are saying. Now, in fairness to Chuck Woolery, I've found very few progressives or Democrats who are going around saying explicitly that Hegel had a better view of politics and morality than our founding fathers. But there's actually, in fairness to Chuck Woolery, a kind of a good idea here, or an insightful idea here, which is that Hegel does give an alternative to the social contract theory of people like John Locke and the so-called founding fathers, the people who wrote things like the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson, and the Constitution. These guys were influenced by the contractarian tradition of people like John Locke. And Locke's ideas are very different from those of Hegel. And Hegel, as I say, he does historicize rationality, he historicizes morality, he historicizes politics. And so a contemporary Hegelian or a contemporary follower of Zhang Xuecheng would say, what's the right thing to do and what's the right way to organize society depends very much on the historical era that you're in. Whereas people like Locke tend to think there are these God-given natural rights that have always been the same and always will be the same. And so they're not going to change over time. So they're actually, I'm making fun of Woolery here, but there's a kernel of an interesting idea actually there in what Woolery say. Now, the thing about both Hegel and Zhang Xuecheng is that although they thought that morality and rationality had to be historicized, they both thought that morality and rationality had reached a peak at a particular point in history. And so no further development was necessary. So the Zhang thought that, history had reached a peak at the beginning of the Zhou dynasty with the sage kings like the Duke of Zhou, whom he keeps referring to. And then he thinks that by Kongzi's time, society had decayed, but Kongzi was preserving and teaching to others the way that it had been perfected at the beginning of the Zhou dynasty. Hegel thought that physics had reached a peak with Newtonian physics, and he thought that society, political organization had reached a peak with the Prussian state of his era. And so one of the big splits in Western thought, and this is useful to know as part of your general education too, is, are you a Hegelian? And do you think that rationality and morality have to be historicized, not subjectivized or relativized, but historicized? And if you're a Hegelian, are you a left Hegelian or a right Hegelian? And right Hegelians think that history has in some way come to an end. So some people think, yeah, you've got to historicize rationality and morality, but guess what? We happen to have the good fortune to live at the period in history where we've reached the apotheosis, the highest level of both rationality and political theory. At the end of the Cold War, a guy named Francis Fukuyama said, well, basically Hegel was right, except that history didn't end in Hegel's era, it's ending now. And he said this a few decades ago. So that's a right Hegelian response. A left Hegelian view is history is always evolving. We're never going to get to the end, and we just have to accept that. So similarly, but John was in a sense thought that history reached a perfect level, but he thought that people in his era were venerating what Kongzi did instead of venerating the approach Kongzi took to his particular historical era. So Dai says, now there's no better way to honor Kongzi than to pay close attention to his character as a man. In other words, not his actions, but his character. If people do not understand the reality of Kongzi, his historical reality, and merely make it their business to revere and worship him, they will talk more and more vaguely and mysteriously about him until the term sage becomes simply an expression interchangeable with divinity in heaven. How will this add to our present understanding? Scholars have paid honor to Kongzi in a way that seems to appropriate him as the founding teacher of their own particular group. In doing this, they reveal that they actually do not understand Kongzi. Kongzi taught the ultimate perfection of the way for human beings. He cannot be said to have taught the ultimate perfection of the way for scholars. So Zhang's complaint is that people in his era are saying, I'm going to be like Kongzi by being a scholar and a teacher. And Zhang says Confucius was a scholar and a teacher because he couldn't get a position in government. If you want to follow Confucius, if you want to follow Kongzi, do what Kongzi would do in your situation. Don't necessarily do what Kongzi himself did in his situation. And so Zhang would say to contemporary Christians, don't do what Jesus did or try to get other people to do what people in Jesus's era did. Do what Jesus would do if he were in your particular social context. How then, Zhang concludes, those who study Kongzi say that they will not attempt any active achievement, but will instead set their sights upon passing on the doctrine in an age when the way is not practiced. That's what Kongzi did. He said, I can't get a position in government, so I'm going to become a teacher and a scholar and an editor. That's the right thing for Kongzi to do in his situation. But if you want to follow Kongzi, don't do what Kongzi did. Do what Kongzi would do in your situation. And to sum it all up, Zhang says, moral patterns cannot be captured in empty words. They need extensive study to give them reality and literary embellishment to give them expression. When these three are combined together, then one is almost there. So in today's lecture, we looked at Dai Zhen and Zhang Xuecheng, two Qing Dynasty Confucian critics of earlier Confucianism. And we saw that Dai Zhen criticized the way in which the Sung Dynasty Confucians understood pattern, and he showed, I think, clearly and irrefutably that the Sung Dynasty and Ming Dynasty Confucians were using pattern in a way that they'd gotten from earlier Buddhist and to a lesser extent Taoist thinkers. And Dai Zhen emphasizes the fact that to be a Confucian, you have to believe in the legitimacy of human desires. And there's nothing wrong with having desires or satisfying them as long as you don't interfere in other people also satisfying their desires in a way that makes them comfortable. And then Zhang has this really revolutionary idea that the classics are all history, meaning they're historical accounts of how sages responded to their circumstances. We can learn something from them, but not if we think we've got to copy what the sages did. Instead, we have to recognize the classics as historicized representations of wisdom in particular contexts, not as things we can just copy and paste into our own context. So thank you for listening today, and I look forward to our next lecture.